The municipal courthouse of Cedar Rapids buzzed with its usual morning activity as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson sat nervously on the hard wooden bench outside Courtroom 3. His worn sneakers tapped rhythmically against the polished floor, while his fingers fidgeted with the wrinkled citation paper he received 2 weeks ago. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the corridor. Marcus adjusted his tie, borrowed from Mr. Chen next door, for the 100th time. It was his first time in a courthouse, and the formal atmosphere made his heart race. Other people waited nearby, a middle-aged woman reviewing documents with her lawyer, an elderly man with a parking ticket, and a couple of teenagers who looked as nervous as he felt. Officer James Rodriguez, the one who had issued the citation, stood near the water fountain, occasionally glancing in Marcus's direction. That day behind the library still played vividly in Marcus's mind. He had just wanted a quiet moment, a brief escape from everything weighing him down. The no smoking sign had been clearly visible, but at that moment, he hadn't cared. Docket number 247, Marcus Thompson, called out the court clerk, a stern-looking woman with silver-rimmed glasses. Marcus stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. As he walked into the courtroom, he could feel everyone's eyes on him. The room was larger than he'd expected, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that made every footstep echo. Several people sat in the gallery, mostly waiting for their own cases to be called. Judge Sarah Bennett sat behind the elevated bench, her expression unreadable as she reviewed the papers before her. At 55, she had earned a reputation for being tough but fair, especially with young offenders. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her black robes seemed to command respect from everyone present. Mr. Thompson, Judge Bennett began, looking up from her papers. You're here today because you were caught smoking in a prohibited area, specifically behind the Cedar Rapids Public Library. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward when called. Your Honor, on January 12th at approximately 4:30 p.m., I observed the defendant smoking behind the public library. This area is clearly marked with multiple no smoking signs. When approached, Mr. Thompson made no attempt to deny his actions. The judge nodded, making a note in her file. She then turned her attention back to Marcus, studying him more carefully this time. She noticed his slightly trembling hands, the dark circles under his eyes, and the way his borrowed tie hung slightly askew. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to say regarding this incident? Judge Bennett's voice was firm but not unkind. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The fluorescent light seemed too bright, the room too quiet. He could feel sweat forming on his forehead as he tried to find the right words to explain himself. I know I shouldn't have been smoking there, Your Honor, he finally managed to say. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she observed something in Marcus's demeanor that made her pause. Years of experience had taught her to look beyond the surface of the cases that came before her, and something about this young man's disposition suggested there was more to his story. How old are you, Mr. Thompson? She asked, though the information was already in front of her. 17, Your Honor. The judge's expression shifted slightly. And where are your parents today? The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with unspoken weight. Marcus swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of his worn jacket. They're not. I live with my grandmother, Your Honor, he replied, his voice cracking slightly. Something in his tone made Judge Bennett set down her pen. The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a routine case about a teenage smoking violation was beginning to reveal layers that no one had expected. Judge Bennett glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Marcus. His shoulders were hunched slightly, as if carrying an invisible burden. She had seen thousands of young people stand before her bench, but something about Marcus Thompson made her want to dig deeper. Mr. Thompson, she said, her tone softening almost imperceptibly, I think we need to have a longer conversation about this situation. She had no way of knowing that her next questions would lead to a story that would touch everyone in the courtroom that day. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Bennett adjusted her reading glasses and leaned forward. Tell me about your grandmother, Mr. Thompson, she said, her tone gentler than before. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. The memory of that morning flashed through his mind. His grandmother, Rose, trying to hide her pain as she took her medications, insisting he shouldn't miss school to stay home with her. My grandmother. She's sick, Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice barely audible. She has stage 4 lung cancer. The irony of him being caught smoking wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. A few feet away, Officer Rodriguez's stern expression softened slightly. He remembered his own grandmother's battle with cancer years ago. She raised me since I was 3, Marcus continued, gaining a bit more confidence as he spoke. My parents. Well, my dad left before I can remember, and my mom. He paused, swallowing hard. She overdosed when I was little. Grandma Rose is all I have. Judge Bennett nodded slowly, making notes while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. The morning light streaming through the high windows cast shadows across her face as she processed this information. How do you manage school and caring for your grandmother? She asked. Marcus straightened his borrowed tie again. I go to school during the day. After that, I work at Chen's diner from 4 to 9, except on Tuesdays and Thursdays when I leave early for Grandma's chemotherapy appointments. Mr. Chen's been really understanding about my schedule. The judge noticed how Marcus's shoulders seemed to carry the weight of responsibilities far beyond his years. His hands, though young, showed the signs of someone who worked hard, slight calluses from carrying plates and scrubbing dishes. The library incident happened on one of your work days, Judge Bennett observed, reviewing the citation. Why were you there instead of at the diner? Marcus's eyes grew distant for a moment. That day, Grandma had a really bad morning. She couldn't keep any food down, and her pain medications weren't working well. I called Mr. Chen and asked if I could come in an hour late. I needed a moment to breathe. The clerk, who had been typing steadily throughout the proceedings, paused briefly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she listened. I found this quiet spot behind the library, Marcus continued. I know smoking isn't allowed there, or anywhere public really, but sometimes, when everything gets too much. His voice trailed off, and he looked down at his shoes. Judge Bennett removed her glasses, placing them carefully on the bench before her. How are you handling all of this, Marcus? She asked, dropping the formal Mr. Thompson for the first time. The question seemed to break something in Marcus. His carefully maintained composure began to crack. I'm trying my best, Your Honor. The hospital bills keep coming, and even with insurance, the medications are so expensive. I'm saving every dollar I can from the diner, but it's never enough. Grandma doesn't know I picked up extra shifts on Saturdays. The gallery, which had been restless with people waiting for their own cases, grew completely still. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased. And school? The judge prompted gently. My grades aren't what they used to be, Marcus admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I try to study late at night after Grandma falls asleep, but sometimes I'm just too tired. My teachers have been patient, but, he shrugged helplessly. Judge Bennett looked down at the citation in front of her. The simple charge of smoking in a prohibited area seemed almost trivial now compared to the story unfolding before her. She had seen thousands of cases in her career, but something about Marcus's situation struck a deeply personal chord. She glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Marcus, who stood there looking both young and impossibly old at the same time. The morning sun had shifted, casting different shadows now, and Judge Bennett realized this case would require more than just a simple ruling on a smoking violation. Marcus, she said, her voice carrying a note that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly, I think there's more we need to discuss here. Judge Bennett adjusted her microphone and glanced at her watch. The morning sunlight had shifted, casting different shadows across the courtroom floor. She had already spent more time on this case than usual, but something told her it was necessary. Your Honor, Officer Rodriguez stepped forward unexpectedly. If I may. The judge nodded, giving him permission to speak. When I found Mr. Thompson that day, he wasn't just smoking, he was crying. Marcus's face flushed red as the officer continued. I didn't include it in my report because, well, it didn't seem relevant to the citation. But now, hearing everything, the officer's voice trailed off, his usual professional demeanor softening. Judge Bennett turned back to Marcus. Is this true? Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the floor. That morning, the doctor had called. Grandma's latest test results. His voice cracked slightly. They weren't good. The cancer had spread to her liver. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. The clerk had stopped typing entirely, her hands resting motionless on the keyboard as she listened. I couldn't go to work like that, Marcus continued. I couldn't let customers see me crying. Mr. Chen has already done so much for us, bringing soup when Grandma's too sick to cook, letting me adjust my schedule for her appointments. I didn't want to burden him more. Judge Bennett removed her glasses again, pinching the bridge of her nose thoughtfully. The case file lay open before her, but she wasn't looking at it anymore. Instead, she was seeing something else, a memory from 30 years ago, when she herself had been a young law student caring for a sick parent. Marcus, she said finally, how long have you been smoking? 6 months, he replied quietly. I know it's stupid, especially with Grandma's cancer. She doesn't know. I never smoke at home, and I always change clothes before going back. The judge nodded slowly. And how do you pay for the cigarettes? Marcus's shoulders slumped slightly. I skip lunch most days. Save the money for my school lunch account. I know it's wrong, but sometimes it helps me stay awake during late shifts or when I'm up all night with Grandma. A woman in the gallery wiped tears from her eyes. Even the bailiff, known for his stoic demeanor, seemed moved by the young man's story. Judge Bennett stood up suddenly, surprising everyone in the courtroom. This court will take a 15-minute recess, she announced. Marcus, I'd like to speak with you in my chambers. Officer Rodriguez, would you join us? As they walked toward the judge's chambers, Marcus could feel his heart pounding. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step echoing against the marble floors. The judge's chambers were smaller than he expected, warm and welcoming, with photographs on the walls and a worn leather couch in the corner. Please, sit down. Judge Bennett gestured to the couch. Officer Rodriguez remained standing near the door, his usual stern expression replaced with something closer to concern. The judge settled into her chair, studying Marcus for a long moment before speaking. What you're doing, caring for your grandmother, working, trying to keep up with school, it's admirable, but it's also destroying you. Marcus started to protest, but she held up her hand. I know because I've been there. Not exactly the same situation, but similar enough. She reached for a photograph on her desk, turning it to face Marcus. It showed a much younger version of herself with a frail-looking woman in a hospital bed. My mother, she explained, cancer. I was in my second year of law school when she got sick. I tried to do it all, study, work, be her caregiver. I nearly broke myself trying. Officer Rodriguez shifted slightly, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest where his own grandmother's locket still hung on a chain under his uniform. But here's what I learned, Marcus, Judge Bennett continued, leaning forward in her chair. Sometimes being strong means asking for help, and sometimes the universe puts people in your path at exactly the right moment. She glanced at her watch again, then back at Marcus with a determined expression. I'm going to make some calls. This smoking citation, we're going to handle it, but not in the way you might expect. First, though, I need you to be completely honest with me about something. Marcus nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When was the last time you had a full night's sleep? Marcus stared at his hands, the question hanging heavy in the air of the judge's chambers. I can't really remember, he admitted quietly. Maybe 3 weeks ago, before Grandma's night fevers got worse. Judge Bennett exchanged glances with Officer Rodriguez, who had moved closer to the desk. The morning light filtering through the office windows highlighted the dark circles under Marcus's eyes, making him look even more exhausted than before. Tell me about a typical day, Marcus, the judge requested, pulling out a notepad. Start from when you wake up. Marcus shifted on the leather couch, his borrowed tie now completely askew. I usually get up around 4:30 a.m. to check on Grandma and give her the morning medications. Then I clean up a bit, make her breakfast, and get ready for school. Sometimes she's too sick to eat, so I sit with her until she can take at least a few bites. He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. School starts at 7:30. I try to stay awake in class, but sometimes he looked down, embarrassed. My English teacher, Mrs. Peters, she lets me take tests during lunch when I accidentally fall asleep in class. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. That's why you were sleeping behind the library that day, wasn't it? Not just smoking. Marcus nodded slowly. I had missed a quiz in biology. Mrs. Peters arranged for me to make it up during lunch, so I hadn't eaten. I was so tired, and the spot behind the library was quiet. I just needed to close my eyes for a minute. Judge Bennett had been writing steadily, her pen moving across the notepad. She looked up, her expression concerned. And after school? Work at the diner until closing, usually. Mr. Chen lets me do homework between customers when it's slow. Then home to help Grandma with her night routine. Medications, bath if she's strong enough, sometimes just helping her move from the bed to the chair. Marcus's voice grew quieter. The nights are the hardest. She's in so much pain sometimes she can't sleep. So I sit with her, tell her stories, or just hold her hand. The office fell silent. Even the distant sounds of the courthouse seemed muted. Judge Bennett set down her pen and stood up, walking to a small cabinet in the corner. She returned with a glass of water, placing it in front of Marcus. "When I was caring for my mother," she began, sitting on the edge of her desk, "I thought I could handle everything alone. Pride, stubbornness, maybe a bit of both. Then one day, I collapsed in the middle of a law lecture, pure exhaustion. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. 'Your Honor, if I may. My wife works at the Community Support Center. They have programs specifically for situations like this.' Judge Bennett nodded thoughtfully. 'Marcus, what you're doing for your grandmother is admirable, but you're not just killing yourself slowly, you're also not giving her the best care possible because you're stretched too thin.' Marcus looked up sharply, hurt flashing across his face. 'That's not a criticism,' the judge continued gently. 'It's impossible for one person, especially a 17-year-old, to provide round-the-clock care, work, and maintain their own health. Your grandmother needs more support than one person can give, and so do you.' She reached for her phone. 'I'm going to make some calls. Officer Rodriguez's wife at the support center, a medical social worker I know at County General, and,' she paused, looking at Marcus intently, 'a grief counselor who specializes in working with young caregivers.' Marcus started to protest, but Judge Bennett held up her hand. 'This isn't optional, Marcus. Consider it part of your sentence for the smoking violation. But first,' she pressed the intercom button on her desk phone. 'Carol, could you please have someone bring us some sandwiches from the cafeteria and call Mr. Chen's diner? Let them know Marcus Thompson won't be in today.' Turning back to Marcus, she saw tears forming in his eyes. 'But Grandma,' he began. 'Is going to be looked after,' Judge Bennett assured him. 'Right now, we're going to eat, and then we're going to make a plan, a real plan, with proper support and resources.' She smiled softly. 'Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we can't do everything alone.' As they waited for the sandwiches to arrive, Judge Bennett's office became a command center of activity. She made several phone calls while Officer Rodriguez sat with Marcus, sharing stories about his own grandmother's battle with illness years ago. 'Your Honor,' Marcus spoke up during a break between the judge's calls, 'I should at least let Grandma know where I am. She'll worry if I don't come home after school.' Judge Bennett nodded, handing him her office phone. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number. After 3 rings, a weak voice answered. 'Grandma.' 'It's me,' Marcus said, his voice catching. 'I'm okay, but I'm still at the courthouse.' The judge. 'She's trying to help us.' He listened for a moment, tears welling up in his eyes. 'No, Grandma, don't apologize. Please don't.' The judge and Officer Rodriguez pretended to be occupied with paperwork, giving Marcus privacy during the emotional conversation. When he finally hung up, his shoulders were shaking with silent sobs. 'She keeps saying she's sorry,' he whispered. 'Sorry for being a burden. She's not a burden. She's all I have.' Carol, the judge's assistant, entered with a tray of sandwiches and drinks. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee filled the room. Judge Bennett noticed how Marcus's eyes followed the food, though he tried to hide it. 'Eat,' she commanded gently, pushing a sandwich toward him. 'When was the last time you had a proper meal?' Marcus took a small bite, then another, larger one as his hunger took over. Between mouthfuls, he admitted, 'I usually just grab whatever's left over at the diner, or sometimes Mrs. Chen sends food home for Grandma, and I eat a little of that.' As Marcus ate, Judge Bennett shared her developing plan. 'I've spoken with the hospital's social worker. They have a program that provides home health aides for cancer patients. It's covered by your grandmother's insurance, but nobody told you about it, did they?' Marcus shook his head, surprised. We just assumed we couldn't afford extra help. That's the problem with our system, the judge sighed. People don't know what help is available. Officer Rodriguez's wife at the support center is arranging for meal delivery services. They have volunteers who cook fresh meals for families dealing with serious illness. But Marcus started to protest. No buts. Judge Bennett interrupted firmly. This isn't charity, Marcus. These programs exist because society recognizes that no one should face cancer alone. Not the patient, and not the family members either. Officer Rodriguez added, My wife also mentioned their youth caregiver support group. They meet twice a month. Kids your age, dealing with similar situations. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone makes a difference. Marcus finished his sandwich, color returning to his face as the food gave him strength. Judge Bennett noticed how he seemed to sit a little straighter, as if some of the weight had lifted from his shoulders. Now, about school, the judge continued. I've spoken with Principal Richards. They'd have a program for students in crisis situations. Modified schedules, extended deadlines when needed, tutoring support. You're not the first student to be dealing with family illness. Tears rolled down Marcus's cheeks, but these were different from before. I didn't know. I thought I had to handle everything myself. I was so scared of failing everyone. Judge Bennett moved from behind her desk to sit beside Marcus on the couch. You haven't failed anyone. You've been incredibly strong. But strength isn't just about carrying burdens alone. It's about knowing when to accept help. Officer Rodriguez checked his watch. The social worker will be here in about 20 minutes. She'll go with us to your house, meet your grandmother, and start setting up the home health care services. And the smoking? Marcus asked quietly, remembering why he was originally there. Judge Bennett smiled. Oh, you're not getting off completely. Instead of a fine, you'll be attending smoking cessation classes at the community center. And, she paused for emphasis, I expect weekly progress reports from you, not just about quitting smoking, but about how you're doing. How you're really doing. For the first time that day, a genuine smile crossed Marcus's face. It was small, tentative, but real. Thank you, Your Honor. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Judge Bennett replied. Just promise me you'll let us help. Sometimes the hardest sentence to serve is accepting that you don't have to serve alone. The drive to Marcus's house felt surreal. He sat in the back of Officer Rodriguez's patrol car, but not as a criminal, as someone being helped. The social worker, Ms. Martinez, followed in her own vehicle, while Judge Bennett had promised to join them after handling some urgent court matters. The small house came into view, a modest single-story building with peeling paint and a small garden that had clearly seen better days. Despite its worn appearance, there were touches of love everywhere. Faded wind chimes hanging from the porch, carefully maintained flower pots, and a welcome mat that read, Home is where the heart is. This is it, Marcus said softly, leading them up the cracked concrete path. His hand shook slightly as he turned the key in the lock. Grandma, I'm home, and I brought some people who want to help us. Rose Thompson was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, wrapped in a faded quilt. Despite her illness, she maintained a dignity that immediately commanded respect. Her thin face lit up at the sight of her grandson, then registered surprise at his companions. Mrs. Thompson, Ms. Martinez stepped forward with a warm smile. I'm Elena Martinez from Social Services, and this is Officer Rodriguez. We're here because your grandson has shown incredible strength, but we believe you both deserve more support. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Marcus's hand. I've been so worried about him, she admitted, her voice weak but clear. He works so hard, does so much, too much for a boy his age. Officer Rodriguez looked around the living room, noting the careful organization of medication bottles, the stack of medical bills on the side table, the textbooks mixed with hospital appointment cards. Everything spoke of a household trying desperately to maintain order in the face of chaos. Ms. Martinez sat down across from Rose, opening her folder. I want to tell you about some programs we have available. Your insurance actually covers quite a few services you haven't been using. As she explained about home health aides, medical transportation services, and meal delivery programs, Marcus stood by his grandmother's chair, still holding her hand. The relief on both their faces grew with each new possibility presented. And for Marcus, Ms. Martinez continued, "We have youth support programs. He can still help care for you, but with proper support and guidance. He needs time to be a teenager, too." Rose squeezed Marcus's hand tighter. "I felt so guilty," she whispered. "Watching him sacrifice everything for me, his childhood, his education." "No, Grandma," Marcus interrupted, kneeling beside her chair. "You gave me everything when Mom died. Taking care of you isn't a sacrifice, it's what family does. I didn't know how to ask for help." Officer Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like to hear about how my wife's community center has been helping families like yours? They've done amazing work." As they talked, a knock at the door announced Judge Bennett's arrival. She entered carrying several bags of groceries. "I hope you don't mind," she said, setting them down. "I thought some fresh food might help while we get everything organized." The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ms. Martinez made calls to arrange immediate home health care services. Officer Rodriguez's wife arrived with information about the community center's programs. Judge Bennett worked with Marcus to create a reasonable schedule that balanced school, rest, and family time. As the afternoon light began to fade, Rose looked around at these strangers who had become allies in their fight. "I don't know how to thank you all," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Judge Bennett sat next to her, taking her frail hand. "Sometimes the universe conspires to bring help exactly when we need it most. A simple smoking cessation brought your grandson to my courtroom today, but I believe it was meant to be much more than that." Marcus, who had been helping Officer Rodriguez bring in more supplies from the car, posed in the doorway. For the first time in months, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The burden hadn't disappeared, but now it was being shared by caring hands and understanding hearts. His grandmother caught his eye and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. They both knew that while the road ahead would still be difficult, they wouldn't have to walk it alone anymore. 2 weeks had passed since that transformative day in the courthouse. The Thompson household had undergone remarkable changes. The arrival of Maria, their assigned home health aide, brought professional care and much-needed relief. She came 5 days a week, allowing Marcus to focus on school while knowing his grandmother was in good hands. On this particular morning, Marcus sat in Judge Bennett's chambers for his weekly progress report. The dark circles under his eyes had begun to fade, and his posture was notably different, less burdened, more teenage-like. "The smoking cessation classes are actually helping," Marcus admitted, fidgeting with the stress ball the program had given him. "I haven't had a cigarette in 10 days. When I get stressed now, I use this ball or try those breathing exercises they taught us." Judge Bennett smiled, making notes in her folder. "And how are things at home with the new arrangements?" "Maria is amazing." Marcus's face lit up. "She knows exactly what to do when Grandma's having a bad day. And the meal delivery service?" He paused, emotion crossing his face. "Mrs. Chen still sends extra food sometimes, but now it's because she wants to, not because we desperately need it." A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Rodriguez entered, carrying a large envelope. "Sorry to interrupt, Your Honor, but I thought Marcus would want to see this right away." Inside the envelope were Marcus's latest school reports. His grades, which had been slipping dangerously low, showed significant improvement. Mrs. Peters, his English teacher, had attached a personal note praising his renewed engagement in class. "I'm actually able to stay awake during lessons now," Marcus explained, pride evident in his voice. "The tutoring program helped me catch up on everything I'd missed. And," he hesitated before continuing, "I started attending the youth support group at the community center." Judge Bennett leaned forward, interested. "How's that going?" "It's helpful," Marcus said thoughtfully. "There's this other kid there, Jamie, whose mom has MS. We kind of understand each other, you know. We talk about stuff we can't really explain to other people our age." Officer Rodriguez sat down, sharing his own update. "My wife says Marcus has become quite an inspiration at the center. He's been helping new members feel welcome, sharing his experience." The judge nodded approvingly. "And how's your grandmother doing with all these changes?" Marcus's expression softened. Her last checkup showed some improvement. "The doctor says reduced stress can actually impact how patients respond to treatment. She's sleeping better now that she's not worrying about me so much. and she started teaching Maria her secret recipe for chicken soup. He laughed softly. She says Maria's version is almost as good as hers. Just then, the judge's phone buzzed with a message. She read it and smiled. Speaking of your grandmother, I just heard from Ms. Martinez. The insurance approved the new treatment protocol they recommended. Full coverage. Marcus's eyes welled with tears. 2 weeks ago, such news would have seemed impossible. The cost of new treatments had been one of his biggest worries. There's something else we need to discuss, Judge Bennett said, pulling out another folder. The community college has a dual enrollment program for high school students. Given your improved grades, Mrs. Peters recommended you for their advanced writing course. It would count for both high school and college credit. Marcus stared at the application forms in surprise. But, would I have time? The classes are scheduled for Tuesday and Thursday mornings when Maria is with your grandmother, Officer Rodriguez explained. My wife already checked the logistics. Judge Bennett watched as Marcus processed this information. The transformation in him over these 2 weeks was remarkable, from a desperately overwhelmed caregiver to a teenager beginning to reclaim his life while still caring for his grandmother. You know, she said gently, taking care of yourself, pursuing your education, accepting help. These things don't mean you love your grandmother any less. They mean you're growing into the person she always wanted you to be. Marcus nodded, running his finger over the college application. She actually said something similar yesterday. She told me seeing me smile again was better medicine than any of her treatments. As the morning sunlight streamed through the office windows, Judge Bennett realized that sometimes the most important sentences handed down in her courtroom weren't punishments at all. They were second chances. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day in the courthouse. The Cedar Rapids Community Center was packed with people gathered for a special evening event. Judge Bennett sat in the front row, beside Officer Rodriguez and his wife, all of them watching proudly as Marcus Thompson stood at the podium. When I was caught smoking behind the library that day, Marcus began, his voice strong and clear, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. It turned out to be the best thing. The audience, filled with members of the Youth Caregivers Support Group, social workers, and families facing similar challenges, listened intently as Marcus shared his story. Rose Thompson sat in her wheelchair in the front row, looking healthier than she had in months, her eyes shining with pride. My grandmother's cancer isn't gone, Marcus continued, but we're fighting it together, and not just the two of us anymore. We have an entire community standing with us. He gestured to the people around the room. Maria, our home health aide, who's become like family. The amazing volunteers who bring us meals. My support group friends who understand exactly what it's like. He paused, looking at Judge Bennett. And sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places, like a judge who saw past a smoking citation to recognize a kid who was drowning and needed someone to throw him a lifeline. Marcus went on to describe the changes in their lives. His grades had improved so much that he was now taking 2 college courses through the dual enrollment program. The dark circles under his eyes were gone, replaced by the natural energy of a teenager. He still helped care for his grandmother, but now it was a labor of love, not a crushing burden. I learned that being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone, he said. Real strength is knowing when to ask for help, and then helping others find their strength too. As if to emphasize his point, he gestured to Jamie, the boy from his support group, who had recently helped another young caregiver connect with services for his family. The ripple effect of kindness and support continued to spread. Rose wheeled herself to the podium with Maria's help. Though still frail, she radiated a quiet dignity. 6 months ago, I was watching my grandson disappear under the weight of responsibilities no teenager should have to bear alone, she said. Today, I see him flourishing, and it's the best medicine I could ask for. After the speeches during the reception, Judge Bennett observed Marcus with his support group friends. They were laughing, sharing stories, being teenagers, while still keeping an eye on their loved ones. It was a beautiful balance. Officer Rodriguez approached the judge, holding a frame. Inside was Marcus's citation from that day, along with a recent photograph of the teen speaking to a group of students about stress management and healthy coping mechanisms. Who would have thought? The officer mused. A simple smoking violation would lead to all this. Ms. Martinez joined them, updating them on the latest developments. The program they had built around Marcus's case was now being implemented across the county, helping other young caregivers find support before reaching their breaking point. As the evening drew to a close, Marcus helped Maria get his grandmother ready to leave. Judge Bennett overheard Rose telling her grandson how his father had called after seeing a social media post about Marcus's community work. For the first time, Marcus was able to discuss this calmly, having learned through therapy to process his feelings about his parents. You know, Marcus said to the judge as they said their goodbyes, "I haven't touched a cigarette in 5 months now. Turns out I didn't need them. I just needed to know I wasn't alone." Judge Bennett watched as Marcus wheeled his grandmother toward their waiting car, where Maria was already arranging blankets and pillows for Rose's comfort. The evening air was cool, but there was warmth in the way the community had come together, in the way lives had been transformed. Sometimes, she said to no one in particular, justice isn't about punishment. It's about seeing the person behind the offense and understanding what they really need. As Marcus's car drove away, the judge smiled, knowing that what had started as a simple court case had become a testament to the power of compassion, community, and the understanding that no one should have to face life's challenges alone.